Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classic Lectures. This is lecture number 72, volume number 12. This is Plutarch's Lives, sometimes referred to as parallel lives for reasons that we'll get into. Now, some have argued, and I know you guys are smiling already because I say this at almost every one of these Harvard Classics lectures, that what we're about to study may be one of the most important titles ever studied, ever written. You know, there's a lot of arguments about this, but I think this text is more influential than we have probably wanted to give it credit, especially in the late 20th century, early 21st century. No doubt, it is the text that influences the idea of the birth of the modern hero, or the idea that individuals, especially, of course, for Plutarch, men, will create history and make history. No question, the power of the biography is now on display. And in many ways, Plutarch wanted to argue as a philosopher of ethics that the way we look at heroes and people of great importance is in some ways kind of like a mirror, in the same way that Aristotle argued, remember, in Poetics, that he said you kind of look into the text on stage and you see reflected back yourself and all of those kinds of ideas. We have a very similar game going on here. By the way, just to remind, in Harvard Classics, remember, we already messed around with several biographies and, of course, as well an autobiography with Augustine's Confessions. Here, though, we're going to have Plutarch intentionally telling us about influential individuals who lived before his time, and why they were so important. And in the process, he's writing almost like a book of, we might say, a book of manners, or a book about how you're supposed to behave and that kind of thing. And to that degree, this text became really influential. For example, Shakespeare and other influential writers will draw heavily from this. And in fact, when we get to the Mark Antony chapter, which will be the last chapter in this volume, we're going to see that. Now, speaking of this volume, the Harvard Classics edition here, unlike the Great Books edition that presents all of Parallel Lives, the Harvard Classics edition will only give us 9 of the 50 people and only 2 of the famous comparisons. Often what Plutarch did in his text is he would give us one individual and then another individual, often Greek and then Roman, and then he would compare the two to each other in these comparison chapters. We're going to get 2 of those comparison chapters in this text. But we do have enough here to really marvel at Plutarch's accomplishments. Now, if you haven't been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, obviously I recommend you do so. Go down that left-hand side and find the Harvard Classics lectures and the previous 71 lectures that we've given. Some of what we're going to talk about, especially at the end of this lecture, will tie back into some of those earlier lectures. For example, we've studied detailed lectures on almost all of Emerson's classic essays. Emerson was very influenced by, of course, Carlyle, as we said. Carlyle was very influenced by this idea, what we sometimes refer to as the great man theory, the idea that humans, especially men, are the ones who determine the history of the world. Now, we always want to come back to our learning theory in these lectures to remember that we are relating new information to old information in meaningful ways. Plutarch was all about this as well, by the way. In other words, you study about Caesar, or you study about Mark Antony, or whoever, and then you kind of see how those mistakes that they made led to their downfall, or the good things that they did led to their successes, and then you try to implement them into your own experience in your own lives, right? When Longfellow, for example, in Psalm of Life said, "Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime and departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time." That idea is very much born, in some ways, of the study of history in Plutarch. Okay? Our 3 levels of reading we don't want to overlook as well. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, we're going to be looking, of course, at the rhetorical component, and especially his eye for detail. Plutarch's eye for detail is remarkable. I'm going to save some of those ideas until the very end chapter in this volume, which will be his Mark Antony treatment. And then finally at 3B, how can I relate this information first to other texts that I know, and then finally, how can I relate it to myself? And we'll kind of finish with this question. If Plutarch really in some ways invents the notion of the hero that should be studied and emulated in some way, maybe not imitated but emulated, that is to say, find the best parts of whoever and then try to, build your life with those ideas ever present in your life. If that is the case, then who are the people that you watch to become the person that you are today? This is an interesting 3B question. For Plutarch, the ironies abound in biography, because although he was the great biography, no one ever actually wrote a biography about him. We know that he was born close to Delphi around 46 Common Era, and he dies 120 Common Era at the age of 73, 74, so he lived a pretty long life. studies math, philosophy at the Academy of Athens. He became a Roman citizen. He was also a priest at Apollo's temple at Delphi for the last 30 or so years of his life. His parallel lives, 23 pairs, one Greek, one Roman, life compared, right? And especially their moral virtues, their vices, the things that made them good men versus the things that made them bad men. Quote unquote good men and bad men. Now we can obviously get into the debate about what Plutarch considers to be legitimately good or bad. A lot of times it comes down to issues like did what they do, in terms of the way they acted, did what they the kind of actions that they commit, did it lead to greater accomplishments of the city-state or whatever? Okay, and then of course we have as well 4 unpaired single lives in the original parallel lives. Now. In his life of Alexander the Great, for example, he doesn't seem to be so much concerned with a history as he is with character, and that's a significant part of this. There are, of course, historians today that will debate some of what Plutarch constitutes as history. We're more interested in today from almost like a psychological rendering, a psychobiological, biographic rendering of these texts, the way that he looks at individuals and says, this was a good man because of A, B, and C. And of course, it's going to be heavily influenced by the philosophy of Plato, which we obviously spend quite a bit of time with, and those 4 cardinal virtues, as we will call them, from the Platonic texts of wisdom and courage and discipline, temperance, and then finally justice. He said, Plutarch, that he was like a painter, giving or trying to give a full portrait of the person. And in many ways, as we've already said, he was a Platonist, a moral philosopher, and in some ways he's kind of the forerunner of the Neoplatonists, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoics, as well as, of course, Plotinus to come. All of those names we've mentioned in earlier lectures. His influence is prodigious, especially Shakespeare. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is born here, his Coriolanus is born here, his Antony, his Cleopatra is born here as well. Carlyle, as we've already said, and in some ways, kind of like the debate between he and Spencer in regards to great men versus great events in history. All of that is born here. I'll give you a quote. The world of man, he said it this way: the world of man is best captured through the lives of men who created history. History is like a faithful mirror in which I observe these great men in order that I may seek to model my own life on their virtues, end quote. Well, I mean, you can't get it much clearer than that, right? Now, we're going to work through the available chapters here, and the goal, of course, is to interest you in reading all of the parallel lives. I hope that this conversation with you will do that, all right? By the way, volume 14 of the great books, if you have both sets of those in your library, or you can find it in a library, is the Parallel Lives. And as we've said many times, most of the Harvard classics that we're studying are available for free online. All you got to do is go and find them, and I certainly recommend that you do that. We're going to be looking at the Dryden translation from 1683. And this is an important translation. Later, Arthur Hugh Clough will as well play around with this one. It's interesting that the choices that are made here by Eliot and the Harvard Classics selectors, that the 9 choices that are made, there are three notable absences that are often considered, the great chapters that aren't here. Alexander, we've already mentioned. Sulla is also withheld, and Cato the Younger is also. However, we're gonna look to see that his view was, quote, power will show the man or demonstrate the man, end quote. So I suggest the following. Let's enjoy these few selected chapters. And we'll, mess around at all 3 levels and see if we can interest ourselves, right? And in that regards, let's return back to an idea that we keep sharing with you in 303. We are the stories, in some fundamental way, we are the stories that we share, the stories that we retell, the stories that we accept, the stories that we reject. And if that is the case, then who are the models that provide the stories that in some way stand behind who we are and what we are? Well, let's turn to the very first of ours, and I mean, I don't have a lot of time with you guys, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a real brief biography, much that's derived from our study of Plutarch, about each one of the individuals. I'll jump into the text itself in Dryden's translation, and then I'll read some of my favorite passages. And over the lecture, I hope that you'll get a sense of who Plutarch was and some of the language that's quite remarkable. Themistocles is the first. He was an Athenian politician from 524 to 559 BCE, the general at the Battle of Marathon. That was the first Persian invasion of Greece, of course. He rebuilt the Greek navy. He defeated the Persians at the Strait of Salamis, and he leaves Greece in disgrace. Now we're going to see this often, how in many of these chapters, Plutarch's fascinated by the fact that a man can rise to prominence, he can do some amazing kinds of work, and then leave disgraced. We're going to see maybe about how that's a mantra that keeps coming back over and over again. Finally, he leaves Greece in disgrace, and he goes to the Persian king, where he hangs out with Artaxerxes, and then ultimately he dies in Persia. In the opening lines, he says this: "It is confessed by all that from his youth he was of a vehement and impetuous nature, of a quick apprehension, and a strong and aspiring bent for action and great affairs." Now, this is the kind of thing where we're going to hear, in other words, almost every one of the men in Parallel Lives started out special, two comments for your notes, started out special in their early years. In other words, long before Freud made that argument that everything that you are is really about how you were raised in your childhood, we have Plutarch saying, you got to look at how people start out, how they are nurtured or trained or educated. And that leads us to our second point. Their education is always hypercritical. You want to find out about a 25 or a 30-year-old person who is kind of a hero and a leader, take a look at the way that individual was raised and especially their education. A little bit later about Themistocles, he says, he went beyond all men in the passion for distinction. This idea of ambition, we'll come back to it over and over again. The idea that some men seem to want to be better known than other men, and for that reason they will make themselves greater, right? He says a little bit later, of two who made love to his daughter, he preferred the man of worth to the one who was rich, saying he desired a man without riches rather than riches without a man. Such was the character of his sayings. And for those of you that say, that sounds kind of like Boccaccio's Decameron, and the conclusion of the story that we study together in 303, Frederico's Falcon, go to learnstrong.net and to the senior A folder and find Frederico's Falcon. You'll see what I'm talking about there. You have the same thing. In other words, the idea is that I would much prefer, he said, a man without riches, but a man who has character, because character is very, very much more important. Our second individual that will be treated in Harvard Classics is Pericles. Plutarch recognizes three life movements in his text: the youth, the career, and the death. And in almost all of his chapters, this is the game that he plays. And three moments, or movements, you might say, in the career. Obscurity to leadership, to some kind of then decline, or often, not being fully appreciated. And we're going to see this in Pericles. This is why I'm pointing this out. The greatest leader of the Greeks. Of course, he's the great builder. He's the one who's responsible or stands behind the construction of things like the Parthenon. Of course, the great inventor, some will argue, or allower of democracy. And of course, he's a tremendous warrior and a fighter as well. 495 to 429 BCE, Pericles. He's the first Greek leader to follow philosophy and Anaxagoras. He's an amazing rhetorical speaker. Now, let's put this in our notes. Plutarch is very influenced and wants to influence future thinkers. I mean, just off the top of my head, the one that comes to mind for me is our great President Abraham Lincoln. But there's this real powerful insistence that if you want to be a great leader, right, and for Plutarch, of course, it's a great man, you have to be able to talk well. Rhetoric is, of course, a huge part of that. But finally, it's not a matter of just knowing how to speak well. You have to elocute well. And Pericles, of course, was able to do that. And he has the famous funeral oration comes to mind, right, for Pericles, right? He says that Pericles ruled for 40 years. He was a great believer of democracy, and there's always been this question whether Pericles actually weakened the state or strengthened Athens. He, of course, with Phidias, the great architect builder, the Parthenon, the golden statue of Athena he mentions. He incites the Peloponnesian War from 431 to 404 BCE, which in many ways is the defining moment of that golden age of Athens, as we've spoken of in other lectures. In 430, a plague will break out. It's an epidemic, and the people, of course, are going to accuse the leader, which often is the case. Pericles will win the struggle versus Cleon, and he will lead all military options in 429. He sees his sons die of the plague, and then, of course, he himself dies in 429. The glory of Athens, many have argued, and certainly Plutarch will argue this as well, that the glory of Athens dies with the death of Pericles, often referred to again as the Golden Age. Let's jump into now just a few of the lines that I enjoy reading, the opening lines of the Pericles chapter. I'm going to read this because, to me, this gives you such a sense of Plutarch as writer. He begins this way. Caesar, once seeing some wealthy strangers at Rome carrying up and down with him in their arms and bosoms young puppy dogs and monkeys, embracing and making much of them, took occasion, not unnaturally, to ask whether the women in their country were not used to bear children. By that prince-like reprimand, gravely reflecting upon persons who spend and lavish upon brute beasts that affection and kindness which nature has implemented in us to be bestowed on those of our own kind, with like reason may we blame those who misuse the love of inquiry and observation, which nature has implanted in our souls, by expending it to objects unworthy of the attention either of their eyes or their ears, while they disregard such as are excellent in themselves and would do them good. The mere outward sense, being passive in responding to the impression of the objects that come in its way and strike upon it, perhaps cannot help entertaining and taking notice of everything that addresses it, be it what it will, useful or unuseful. But in the exercise of this mental perception, every man, if he chooses, this is of course a key, right? Every man, if he chooses, has a natural power to turn himself upon all occasions and to change and shift with the greatest ease to what he shall himself judge desirable. And of course, a few years later, this will sound very much like Machiavelli's Prince, won't it? So that it becomes a man's duty to pursue and make after the best and choicest of everything, that he may not only employ his contemplation, but may also be improved by it. For as that color is most suitable to the eye, whose freshness and pleasantness stimulates and strengthens the sight, so a man ought to apply his intellectual perception to such objects as, with the sense of delight, are apt to call it forth and allure it to its own proper good and advantage. Such objects we find in the acts of virtue, which also produce in the minds of mere readers upon them an emulation, not notice imitation, but emulation, and eagerness that may lead them on to imitation. In other words, emulation, the idea of similarities, lead to try to do it as closely as you can. In other things, there does not immediately follow upon the admiration and liking of the thing done any strong desire of the doing the like. Nay, many times on the very contrary, when we are pleased with the work, we slight and set little by the workman or artist himself, as for instance in perfumes and purple dyes, we are taken with the things themselves well enough, but do not think dryers and perfumers otherwise than low and sordid people. It was not said amiss by Anethises that when people told him that one Ismenias was an excellent piper, he may be so, said he, but he is but a wretched human being, otherwise he would not have been an excellent piper, end quote. And King Philip, to the same purpose, told his son Alexander the Great, who once at a merrymaking played a piece of music charmingly and skillfully, said, quote, "Are you not ashamed, son, to play so well?" End quote. In other words, you spent so much time learning how to play this music so well when you should have been doing something else. For it is enough for a king or prince to find leisure sometimes to hear others sing, and he does the muses quite honor enough when he pleases to be but present, while others engage in such exercises and trials of skill, allocation of energies, and energy conservation, obviously. Now again, this is a remarkable introduction. We haven't gotten to Pericles yet. It's just Plutarch giving us the argument why we should pay attention to biography. I'm going to make the argument at the conclusion that you could do a whole lot worse than sitting down and reading 10 or 20 really important, influential biographies as a young student, especially in the field or discipline that you're most interested in, as you start to kind of make your considerations about how you will grow and evolve as person and professional. To continue, he who busies himself in mean occupations produces, in the very pains he takes about things of little or no use, an evidence against himself of his negligence and indisposition to what is really good, waste of time, in other words. Nor did any generous and ingenuous young man in the slide of the statue of Jupiter at Pisa ever desire to be a Phidias, or on seeing that of Juno at Argos, long to be a Polycletus, or feel induced by his pleasure in their poems to wish to be an Emachion or a Philetias, and he's naming these poets, in other words, right? For it does not necessarily follow that if a piece of work please for its gracefulness, therefore that he that wrought it deserves our admiration. Whence it is that neither do such things really profit or advantage the beholders upon the sight of which no zeal arises for the imitation of them, nor any impulse or inclination, which may prompt any desire or endeavor of doing the like. But virtue, by the bare statement of its actions, this may be some of the most important lines in all of parallel lives, but virtue, by the bare statement of its actions, can so affect men's minds as to create at once both admiration of the things done and desire to imitate the doers of them. The goods of fortune we would possess and would enjoy. Those of virtue we long to practice and exercise. We are content to receive the former from others. The latter we wish others to experience from us. Moral good, boy does this sound like Emerson's essays. Moral good is a practical stimulus. It is no sooner seen than it inspires an impulse to practice and influences the mind and character, not by a mere imitation which we look at, but by the statement of the fact creates a moral purpose which we form. For your notes, let's just make the distinction really quickly that you're going to have Plutarch here making a distinction between being a celebrity and being a hero. Right? You can be a celebrity, you can be well known, but to be a hero, for Plutarch, you're going to have certain kinds of virtues in your life, and again the Platonist virtues come to mind, that are going to help to provide us a roadmap for the way we want to act. Well, quickly, a few more lines from the Pericles chapter. There's so many of this. I wish I had time. I would read much more of this for you. He says about Pericles, real excellence indeed is most recognized when most openly looked into, and in really good men, nothing which meets the eye of external observers so truly deserves their admiration as their daily common life does that of their nearer friends. The idea that we become in many ways what we are constantly